Hi folks, welcome to our video today on electing the president. So we are going to be walking through the presidential election process and how one, kind of goes from starting out their candidacy to actually becoming the actual president and living in the White House. So goals for today: explain the presidential election process and what those steps are, and also to describe how something called incumbency and modern campaigns impact the election process. So I have asterisks on this slide because this is not on your notes. However, you might want to jot down a few of these characteristics. So looking at who becomes president, we do have a couple of constitutional requirements outlined in the Constitution. For example, you have to be at least 35 years old, a natural born citizen, and have to have lived for 14 years prior to in the country prior to becoming president. So those are the actual formal requirements in the Constitution. Now, there are some informal requirements as well, and these simply are like trends that we see among all of our presidents for the most part so far. Obviously there are a few exceptions to this, but most presidents have had some sort of experience in government and politics, like whether that's the executive, meaning they're a state governor, for instance, legislative, right? A lot of them are Congress people, senators, representatives, and then even military service is a huge experience factor that sometimes goes into this. Now, obviously, we've had exceptions to that. President Trump and Ronald Reagan didn't necessarily have much experience when it came to politics and government. So there are exceptions. That's why it's informal. Campaigns, as we will see, are very, very expensive. So having money is also an informal requirement, or having the ability to fundraise. And their image as well, right? With these candidate-centered campaigns that we've seen pop up in modern times, right? The candidate's image and their past experiences and any scandals that they've maybe had are going to definitely be, kind of at the forefront of public opinion. And also being a good speaker, right? Again, with candidate-centered campaigns, our eyes as the public are on these candidates. So we want someone that looks like they are competent and acts like they can do a good job. And also believing, looking at their track record, that they will. Okay, so this is officially where your notes start. So we're going to look at the steps leading to the White House, the road to the White House. The presidential campaign has evolved over time. It's become much longer in modern times. So the campaign now requires 2 or more years of advance work. So you'll start to hear about people potentially running for the nomination pretty early on, right? And a lot of people typically put their names out there, right? At one point prior to 2020, we had like 20 Democratic candidates that were thinking about, vying for that Democratic nomination. Before formally announcing their candidacy, those hopefuls will tour the country. They'll make TV appearances, right, just to get kind of their name out there and kind of think about, is this something that looks feasible? Am I getting enough coverage that people will vote for me? And this is called the invisible primary. This is sometimes called the media primary or the money primary. This is that time period where they've kind of announced their intent to run for the nomination, and before they actually, start campaigning. And this is where candidates are trying to gain the front runner status, raise the most money, get the most media attention. And success in this invisible primary, and it's invisible because, right, there's no actual voting happening, but success here is usually indicative of success in the actual formal events as we further our journey to the White House. Now, I want to talk about that incumbency advantage. And to do that, we have to talk about what an incumbent is. An incumbent is a candidate who already holds office and is seeking re-election. Now, this is a little different with the presidency because there are term limits on the presidency. When we talk about Congress, we'll talk about incumbents even more, but this trend still occurs in presidential elections. Now, what we see is that the incumbent because they are the incumbent and already holding office, has a very distinct advantage to their challengers. So far as we can see, data suggests that the rate of reelection is very high, up near 80%. Now, as we have seen in 2020, that's not, a definitive fact, right? President Trump is the incumbent for the presidency. However, he did not win re-election. Now, what we find is that the incumbent has a much easier time securing the nomination than the challenger. And reason being, they can use the tools of the presidency that they've had for now 4 years to actually help them get reelected, right? They have name recognition. They've been in the position for 4 years. They have that experience. They're already well known. They've proven that they can win a national election. They already have networks built to campaign, right? They've won once before. They can use that campaign network. They have donors that have contributed to their campaign before, which is super crucial for fundraising. So overall, those things lead to an advantage. Now, these 4 steps is going to be what we're going to be talking about next when we're looking at the road to the White House. So we're going to start here at step 1. And step 1 is kind of the preliminary process. And that happens in one of 2 ways, depending on the state. So that's a caucus or a primary. Once those are finished, we have a national convention, each party does. We have the general election, and then the electoral college. And then finally, in January, we have the actual inauguration of the president. So let's talk about primaries and caucuses. So primaries and caucuses are both ways that states determine who is going to get the nomination for the party. Now, remember, elections are state run. And because we have that 10th Amendment and elections are state run, states can decide their primaries, their rules in their primaries, and whether or not they have a caucus. And we'll talk about what those are. Now, the goal during this stage for candidates is to win the nomination. You want that official endorsement by the political party, right? The nomination is basically the only way that you can actually run for president. Now, to win that nomination, you have to win state primaries and caucuses to earn enough delegates from each state. And those delegates are going to go on to step 2 at the convention and cast their vote for who they think the nominee should actually be. Now, let's talk about primaries. I have put stars next to primary elections because those are the most common among the 50 states. And primaries are elections. They look very similar to general election day, right? Voters are very silent, voting in voting booths. And the voters are going to choose the nominee or the delegates that are pledged to the nominee. And this gives voters power versus political parties, and we'll see how that differs in the caucus. But this kind of this primary surge arose during that progressive era where there was a lot of political corruption. And we see a push for primaries during the progressive era to make the process more democratic, right? Where people are now kind of deciding who should be the nominee versus those already in power. Now, these primaries can award their delegates, it's based on the state, proportionally or winner take all. So it kind of just depends on the state. Now, we have a couple of different primaries that states can have. Closed primaries are primaries where voters must declare their party affiliation in advance of the election in order to vote. So what that means is usually when you register to vote, you can say whether or not you are a Republican or Democrat. You cannot vote in a closed primary unless you have done that in advance of the election. Okay. Now that contrasts to an open primary where voters can declare their party affiliation on election day. And that is Ohio. It's kind of a hybrid. There are a little bit more restrictions, but for the most part, it's an open primary. So on an open primary, what would happen is you would go into the polling place and they would ask if you wanted a Republican or Democratic ballot, and they would give you that particular ballot based on your statement that day, so you don't have to do anything beforehand. And then blanket primaries are the rarest form of primaries. Only a few states have them, but these are primaries really pioneered in the West and in California. These are also called nonpartisan primaries because they allow voters to cast votes for candidates in multiple parties. So like all the candidates are on one single sheet and you can vote for Republicans and Democrats on your sheet versus the other primaries where you are given just a Democratic ticket or just a Republican ticket. So blanket primaries allow their voters to kind of split their tickets or split their ballots. So I just wanted to kind of show you an example or the map of the U.S. in terms of who has what kind of primary system. So you can see Ohio is kind of a hybrid, but mostly open, right? California, we've only got a few states that have those blanket primaries. Now, on the other hand, we have caucuses, and caucuses look very different from primaries, and they're less common. Only a few states have them. These caucuses are where party members are going to meet and discuss or debate candidates and cast their votes. So unlike primaries, which are silent, caucuses actually get pretty loud. It's people trying to basically rally as much support as they can for the candidates that they support, because a candidate is awarded the number of delegates proportionate to the number of supporters they have at the caucus. So this image here up in the top right is kind of very indicative of a caucus, right? It's going to basically be groups trying to get people from other candidates to join their group, right, to earn more votes for their candidate that they support. Now, this is going to give a little bit more power to the political party and be a little bit more elite. And here's why. These are usually during the day. It's not like an election where it's arranged. It's like a 2-hour time span. So it's more of a time commitment to partake in a caucus. It's less convenient to attend and more, like I said, time consuming. And those who do show up tend to be more dedicated voters with very strong views. And as a result, they tend to lean more ideologically left, further left, or ideologically further right. So you kind of have more of a say political party wise than a primary where the voters are really deciding. Now, what we've seen over time is that states try to front load these primaries and caucuses, meaning they're trying to hold them earlier and earlier to try and capitalize on the media attention and to boost their political clout, right? And this is kind of a negative because it's led to quite a few candidates, right? At least, paying more attention to where these primaries and caucuses happen, especially those early ones, and leaving the other 48 states with less, coverage or resources. So the first caucus happens in Iowa, and the first primary is in New Hampshire. So those are really the two that kind of kick off this process. Now, Super Tuesday is when pretty much the rest of the primaries are held. That's not always the case, as I'll show you in a second. But this is the day when the largest number of states hold their primaries and caucuses, usually in February or March. So as you can see here, these orange states are all of your Super Tuesday states. So that's all happening in March. This was for 2020, March 3rd. And then you can see by May or June, all of the other states are finished with their primaries and caucuses. Now, voter turnout is very, very low and unrepresentative in primaries and caucuses. Since the 60s, representation or turnout, I should say, ranges from 15% to 30%. We're still getting data from 2020 because everything was bonkers, but 2016 saw 28.5% of eligible voters voting in the primaries and caucuses. So very, very few people actually turn out here. And then more of them, as we saw in our last video, are going to show up for the presidential election or the general election. Now, the second step in this process are party conventions. And this is where the delegates from the primaries and caucuses are going to come from each state and cast their vote based on how their state selected or voted in their primary or caucus. Remember that party conventions are also where the party platform is written. And these usually take place in the summertime of an election year. Now, something unique to the Democratic Party is something called superdelegates, and superdelegates are influential party members who are able to vote how they want toward a nomination. So they're not necessarily selected by the voters themselves, but they're those party members who can vote how they want. They're not really tied to those state selections, and we see that significant in that Democratic Party. And this is also where the official nomination will take place. The candidate will give a speech, and this is really going to kick off the campaigning for the general election, which is step 3. Now, the general election is almost always a two-person race, right? Usually between Republican and Democrat for reasons like we saw before. After that nomination is made at the convention, the RNC or the DNC, Republican National Convention, Democratic National Convention. This is where rallies start to happen, speeches are given, they're going to tour the country. We're going to see debates between the presidential candidates and the vice presidential candidates. And this is also where we see an increase in campaigning strategies as well for TV and social media. And these resources and this attention is going to be given mostly to swing states versus safe states. So swing states are those states where the party that is victorious will change or fluctuate from election to election. And this is where your candidates during this time period are going to hold campaign events and really spend a bulk of their advertising money, right? Versus your safe states where, it's kind of automatic that, California is going to be Democrat, Texas is going to be Republican, for instance. They're not going to spend as much money there because they know roughly how the election's going to go. Now, campaign strategy is different for primary and general elections, and the reason is the target audience is going to differ. During the primaries, candidates are going to appeal to party activists. They're going to appeal to people who feel very, very strongly toward their party. They might be more tailored and more specific in who they are targeting as they're campaigning. But the general election, and we're going to see those candidates appeal to the middle, the wider base, maybe become more moderate, or try to appeal to those independent voters, gain as much of a voting block as they can. And I wanted to talk about here really quickly just the cost of campaigns. Again, we're still getting data from 2020, but it was predicted that 2020 was going to be about $11 billion in campaign spending, which is astronomical. Now, the media at this stage is also going to begin daily coverage on who's ahead. You're going to see that on almost every news station, right? Who's ahead in polls, measured by public opinion, who's ahead in campaign funding, because usually there's a correlation between who spends the most and who wins. The candidate at this stage will also pick a vice president running mate, and they're chosen to balance the ticket, right? So they're maybe chosen based on a characteristic or an experience that maybe the presidential candidate lacks to try and bring in more voters and appeal to a broader voting base. And then we have election day finally on that first Tuesday in November. And this is where votes cast here make up that popular vote, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So the Electoral College is our final step here. And Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution states that electors are going to determine the president and vice president, not the people. So remember, we are in a representative democracy. This is indirect. We indirectly elect the president. Why this was put in place, you have to remember your elite democracy that we talked about at the beginning of the year. So remember, our founders were very concerned about tyranny of the majority. So this was put into place to kind of temper public opinion, prevent that tyranny of the majority, and allow the more elite or informed at the time statesmen to select the president, the more informed politicians with more experience. Largely that's a reason why the Electoral College is kind of debated today. And we'll talk about that in a future class. But, it was originally meant to kind of prevent the popular vote from, kind of going tyrannical. Now, in the Electoral College, we have 538 electors. Each state has as many votes as it does members of Congress. So how we get to 538 are 100 senators, 435 members of the House, and then we have 3 votes for Washington, D.C., if you remember that 23rd Amendment. So that is how we get to 538. Now, the number of votes in each state is not fixed. The number of votes, as you see here, each number, that's the number that each state has. Because the House is involved, right, and that's based on population, states can gain or lose electoral votes depending on their population. So like if you look back into the early 2000s, Ohio had like 21 electoral votes. It just depends. So that's what I mean when I say it's not fixed. There's always going to be 538, but the allocation of the votes is going to differ. Now, most states are winner take all, as we talked about earlier. The candidate who wins that plurality of the popular vote, not necessarily the majority, but the plurality, is going to receive all of the state's electoral votes. Only Maine and Nebraska allow for a split in their electoral votes. And most states require their electors to follow that state's popular vote. And in the summer, the Supreme Court actually ruled that it is constitutional for states to have laws that do this. So we're probably going to see more and more states requiring electors to follow that popular vote, whereas before, without a law, they technically don't have to. You have to win 270 electoral votes to become president. That's a simple majority. And if no one gets to 270, the House decides the president and the Senate decides the VP. Now, the Electoral College doesn't cast their vote until December, so about a month after the general election. And that's where they officially cast their votes for president and vice president. And usually, the candidate who wins the popular vote wins the Electoral College, but not always because of the system. It has happened 5 times in our history where the electoral vote winner lost the popular vote. So 1824, we had John Quincy Adams, Rutherford B. Hayes, Ben Harris, and then most recently, George W. Bush and Donald Trump in 2016. So it does happen. And I did put this here if you guys wanted to pause the video and take a screenshot. This is kind of what we've just talked about in a nice chart, in a visual. So feel free to pause, take a picture if you feel like you would like this for your records. But remember, we've got those constitutional requirements, primaries and caucuses, the National Convention, general election, and then the Electoral College. All right, guys, so that was quite a bit. Your goals were to explain the presidential election process, describe how incumbency and modern campaigns impact the election process itself. So make sure to go back if you need to. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I will talk to you guys soon. Thanks for watching. See ya.